So we're going to spend this hour working together quite gently. If I get 60 minutes of your time, rather than hold forth and lecture at you, I think it's actually a chance for us to try some tools and maybe actually just very gently think through what we're going to do as we plan our way through uncertain or challenging conditions. Before we get started though, I do just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're each on and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the form of words we use to acknowledge Indigenous ownership of the land in Australia, where I do an awful lot of work. And the flags you can see here in front of you are the flags of Aboriginal Australia and the flags of the Torres Strait Islander people, another Indigenous group within Australia. And I learned to say this acknowledgement of country on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people in what is now Brisbane, and the lands of the Jarowair and Gayabal people in what is now the city of Toowoomba. And as I said last week, wherever we are in the world, and even when we gather on digital space, there is a history to the land that we inhabit and the land that we work on. There have been different questions and challenges to who belongs to a place or who a place belongs to, who has authority over a place, who can identify with a place and ultimately decide what happens there. And those histories haven't remotely been dealt with. And especially when we talk to one another through lenses and screens, there's a danger that they get forgotten. So thank you for allowing me to acknowledge country in this way. And I hope it's a chance for us all to reflect as we think about planning for the future on the particular histories of the land that we're each standing on. I know we've got guests in the United States, we've got people on this call in Canada, and I can see that Peter from Aotearoa, New Zealand, will also have had his experience of acknowledging Maori traditions as well when gathering. So thank you everyone for coming together today. By way of a recap, in my effort to practice what I preach, we're talking about designing for uncertainty. So I designed this second session as one that can work as a standalone. So whether or not you attended last week, you can still get benefit from the next 60 minutes. But the aim was to break down the process of deciding to do something under conditions of uncertainty into these 4 stages. What's going on? What matters? What should we try? And where do we start? And you can see each one of these is, first of all, an expansive moment of going out and thinking more broadly, and then narrowing down and focusing. And this is a double diamond design method. It's adapted from a diagram which is quite well known in design circles. And as always, with everything today, I will send Davis a PDF handout with these slides and further reading on it. So if there's anything that comes up that you're interested in, you can take a note now, but if you miss it, don't worry, because the PDF will come along. And if you want to know more about the mysteries of the double diamond, you can find that out in due course. I will just briefly recap from last time, just to say this, that from when we start at kindergarten, we think of time as a single line running from the past through the present into the future. We're taught to draw these in kindergarten or first grade. They only run from left to right because the English language is written from left to right. And they fool us into thinking sometimes that the future is kind of predictable or controllable, or that we're on a single continuum and we're kind of safe on that journey into the future. Of course, years like 2020, presidential elections and Brexit and all kinds of events which are occurring around the world right now remind us that we can often be pulled off course from the future we were expecting, pulled down the wrong pants leg of time, as it were. And so we spent some time last week thinking about tools for exploring that issue. And what we realized was that actually, if you create some images of the future which await, if instead of waiting for a crisis to break upon us, you actually start to think about those divergences in advance and imagine the futures which you might have to inhabit, you can kind of get ahead of the curve. Instead of waiting for a pandemic or a political upset or a technological shock to strike us, you can run ahead and say, what if that future happened? If I could imagine that future, how will they look back on the decisions I'm making today? Can I use an imagined future scenario as a vantage point from which to look back on the decisions I face now and maybe make more strategically smart choices, even when I know that the present might be pulled off down the wrong pants leg of time, of course. And so we looked at the notion of drawing islands representing the ecosystem we currently inhabit. And the sea around those islands represented all the uncertainties and driving forces which shape life on the island, which shape life in our ecosystem. You can draw multiple islands to consider the different ways that forces could play out, the ways that pandemic response might play out, the ways in which our relationship to technology might play out. We can do this for decisions in the immediate short term, or we can go very far into the future. I was doing some work with the Royal Dutch Library in the Netherlands, and we were looking at the future of the written word, like the long-term future of reading and writing and literacy, constructing plausible futures that might be relevant even 100 years from now. What would it be like to go that far out and reflect on what we face in the present? What could that perspective teach us? So just to get us started, as we move from this question of the distant future into actually doing something in these uncertain and turbulent times, I want to ask you this and just give you a minute or two to think about your answer. What's the first time you can ever remember making a plan? Go right back to your earliest childhood. What's the first time you can ever remember making a plan, and how did it work out? Did you plan to run away from home and just grab a teddy bear and some boiled eggs and cheese from the fridge and start walking down the lane? Did you make a plan for what you were going to take to school one day? Did you make a plan for a birthday party? What is the first time you can remember making a plan, and how did it work out? Just take a minute now to think, and when you've got an answer, just pop it into the chat for me. Melanie planned a made-up game during recess. It was good. I like this one. Melanie, tell us some more. Davis thinks it was her 5th birthday party. Davis, what was the theme of your 5th birthday party? What did you plan? Did you choose the guests? Did you choose the cake? Did you choose where you went? Mary Carroll remembers going to play with a friend over the winter holidays. But it didn't work out. Mary Carroll, why didn't it work out, that trip to see your friend in the winter? Davis planned a trip to McDonald's, which she finds mildly embarrassing now, but I think that's fine in the times. Helen Crossan planned a play date with friends and with Barbie dolls. Mary Carroll had her tonsils out instead of going to be with her friend. Talk about planning for uncertainty. Having your tonsils out at 5 is the equivalent of Brexit or a COVID-19 outbreak. Anything else? Anyone else want to share? What's the first time you can ever remember making a plan, and how did it work out? Natalie made a code with her friends so we can write secret notes. I love that one. Mary, like me, would take tonsils over Brexit. Anyone else? We always think of planning as being this very adult thing, but actually we do it from exceedingly young. And before even someone starts teaching us about a timeline at school, what's the first time you can remember making a plan? How did it work out? I'm going to take a few seconds more. I just want to see 1 or 2 comments. You don't have to share some secret childhood memory, but just think back, because I struggled. I was like, did I plan to leave home? Anthony remembered going to play with a friend, planning a game of touch football, but a snowstorm spoiled it. Anything else? Trina planned to walk to her grandma's, which we did almost daily with her mum, and she got lost. That's the worst bit, isn't it? You think you know the territory when you're a kid, and then you actually were relying on your adults more than you thought. And now I think about it, when I moved house when I was 5 years old, we had 2 neighbors called Ruth. One of them lived next door and one of them was down the street. And my mum said, take this plant pot to Ruth, we're going to give it away, because we couldn't take everything in the moving van. And I took it to the wrong Ruth, because I went and dropped off the plant pot and my mum said, you crossed the road by yourself? That was the wrong Ruth. So it's funny how our sense of the territory varies when we're young. And Jerry said that she'd resolved in nursery school not to eat their nasty lunches ever again. They called her mom. Such a good example. So what I'm taking from these suggestions is, quite often, even from the earliest stage, planning involves other people and their choices and decisions. It involves things that get in the way that could be external, like a snowstorm coming and spoiling your plans, or they could be internal, like you suddenly need to have your tonsils removed. Like, what's the organizational version of needing your tonsils removed? And sometimes it can be about trying to choose our way away from something. As Jerry's saying, it's trying to choose your way away from a nasty lunch rather than towards something nice, like the fancy McDonald's birthday party that Davis wanted when she was 5. I wanted us to think about this because I am going to get you now to try and think about the context that any plan you make might have to inhabit. because this is really what makes this about planning for uncertainty. It's not the business of resolving to do something or deciding how. It's coping with the fact that the world which our plans will inhabit is uncertain, is turbulent, won't turn out the way it used to turn out in the past. So what I'm going to get you to do is take a piece of paper, put it landscape with the long sides at the top and the bottom, and just put an arrow in each corner like this. And I'm just going to give you a moment to do that now. And I always like to get people drawing and putting their ideas out on a piece of paper, but it's not like it has to be artistically brilliant, as you can see. It's just a way of making sure that all our thoughts aren't just in our head, but they're out in the world where we can start to read them, share them, deal with them, question them, redraft them perhaps even. And what I'm going to get you to do is think about two things. That arrow there on the right-hand side is everything that's coming towards us from the future, everything that's going to come over the horizon that hasn't arrived yet. And that arrow on the left is all that stuff from the past, which is still catching up with us. Because when we think about the future and when we think about the uncertain worlds that our plans might have to inhabit, it's really easy to think about it as if it was all whooshing towards us like a spaceship coming over the horizon. But actually, more often than not, the future overtakes you over your shoulder. It's the consequence of things which are already happening. It's about stuff which you're not going to get away from anytime soon. It's about institutional legacies and challenges and issues. It's about the consequences of things that have happened. So climate change, for example, is a consequence of having burnt all those fossil fuels in the past. In many ways, COVID is already something which dropped in the pond like a stone, and we are now just dealing with its ripples. COVID is no longer coming towards us from the future. It's actually something catching up with us from its original origins, whether that was a cavern full of bats in China or something else. So I'm going to get you to start by focusing on that top right-hand corner, things coming towards us from the future. And what I want you to do very briefly is jot down some answers. Imagine you're making decisions for yourself or your institution. This could be for your team within the organization you serve. But when you think about that future coming towards you over the horizon, all the things that haven't happened yet, what do we know is coming? What do we fear? What do we hope? What do we expect? What have we failed to prepare for? And what can't we avoid? What I want you to do is jot down as many different answers as you can find to any and all of those questions. And I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to get that done. So see if you can get your answers. You don't have to put them in an order. You don't have to organize them. But any answer you've got to any of those questions, put it in a cloud around that arrow on the top right-hand side. When it comes to the future, what do we know is coming? What do we fear? What do we hope? What do we expect? What have we failed to prepare for? What can't we avoid? And I'm sure as you jot these down, keep going, it makes you think about the things that we really rely on and assume will take place. You know, for example, with electoral cycles, we kind of assume there will be an election every 4 years, and then we assume there will be a transition on a given date, and all kinds of things that we take for granted or expect become complicated in these turbulent situations. And also we look at things through these lenses of hope and fear, which sometimes help us and are sometimes distorting. So at whatever scale you're looking at, you might be thinking of, you know, I have a role at Metro or NYPL. What do I know is coming for me? You could be looking at a whole organization. I'm currently doing this work for a corporation in the Southern Hemisphere, but also for the whole of the European Union. And we're asking these same questions with slightly more sophisticated tools. So I'm just going to give you maybe another minute and a half to really look at those questions and maybe come up with multiple answers. What do we know is coming? What do we fear? What do we hope? What do we expect? What have we failed to prepare for? And what can't we avoid? I'm just going to give you a few more seconds, just shy of half a minute. Last 10 seconds. Get one more answer down. And that's time. So I'm doing it this way so that you get a taste of what it's like to use these tools. I'm sure you can see that one could easily spend half an hour, 3/4 of an hour answering all those questions, even by yourself, let alone doing it with colleagues as well. Back in the day, we used to do this in workshops with big pieces of paper, but you might find yourself doing this on a cloud platform in a shared Google document now. As you look at your answers, I just want you to reflect and just put something in the chat for me. Which question was hardest for you to answer? For Natalie, it was what we expect. For Melanie, it was the things we can't avoid. For Helen, it was the things we've failed to prepare for. There's a great economist called Thomas Schelling who says it's almost impossible to get someone to think of something that hasn't occurred to them. What do we know is coming is hard for Jerry. Fear is hard for Marie. Mary Carroll says what we've failed to prepare for. Same for Gretchen, same for Peter. For Peter, what do I expect? For Shima, and forgive me if I've mispronounced your name, it's hard for me reading for the first time, it's what we can't avoid. Same for Anthony. For Helen, it's what do I expect? For Lisa, it's what we failed to prepare for. So one of the things I want you to think about, if you choose to use this tool with colleagues or with a team, different people will find different questions easy or difficult. You might think that everyone knows what they expect, and you might think that everyone is blind to the things that they failed to prepare for, but that's not necessarily the case. And some organizations or individuals or cultures or teams will struggle more expressing fears and hopes, will struggle more admitting that they know something is coming with certainty, or they know there's something they can't avoid. So I want you to just think about how you answered that cloud of questions, and where the places were that were comfortable for you and where the places were that were uncomfortable, because those might be where your strategic blind spots lie. And if you choose to take this simple tool away and use it with your colleagues, they might have different tender places when it comes to the future to the ones that you have. Like I said, I want you to have a taste of the tool. We're not going to save the world in 60 minutes. So we're going to move on and look at the arrow in the bottom left-hand corner now. This is the arrow of things which are coming from the past, but will still be with us in the future. And once again, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes because there are fewer questions, but I want you to write down all your answers to these. What will we still be dealing with? What can't we get away from? What isn't finished yet? What will we still be dealing with? What can't we get away from? What isn't finished yet? And that's 2 minutes. I'm just going to talk for a moment or two more. So if you want to add anything in this bottom left-hand corner, feel free to add a few more points while I'm talking. 2 examples relating to libraries occur to me from this bottom left-hand corner. One of them was when I visited Mississippi and worked with library directors at the Mississippi Library Commission. And one of the libraries that was an excellent library with a really committed library director, the entire second floor of that library was unusable because of toxic mold. And because of the state of public funding within Mississippi and the disposition of the politicians, their unwillingness to put money into public libraries, realistically, one of the things that they would still be dealing with is we're not going to be able to open that second floor because of toxic mold, because we're just not going to get the money to fix that anytime soon. When we imagine the future that our library service inhabits, it's almost certainly one that still has toxic mold on the second floor. And I also did this work with about 100 people from across an entire library service. And in that bottom left-hand corner, they were all putting the same phrase. They were putting Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase kept appearing in the bottom left-hand corner. What can't we get away from? What isn't finished yet? Chevy Chase. And I thought, the actor? Because I didn't really have any references. It's like it's either an ancient Scottish poem or it's a comedy actor. And it turned out they had a branch called the Chevy Chase branch of the library in this American library service. And it wasn't very heavily used, but it was in a very well-to-do suburb. And every time they tried to close Chevy Chase for lack of use, the local residents campaigned and made a fuss, and they had an inside line to City Hall. So they did a great job lobbying for Chevy Chase to stay open, partly because they thought that having a public library kept their house prices up. And it made it a nicer community to be in, even though basically no one used it. So Chevy Chase was this building that sat there, open on Saturdays, and then open during the week with a skeleton staff drawing on the rest of the service, but actually not really providing value and existing for political reasons. And it really came out that the whole service at every level of authority, at every rank, everyone said Chevy Chase is just something we're still going to be dealing with. So talking about the future in terms of these arrows highlighted that as a major strategic issue to address. What do we do with that building? Can we also use it as a training center for city services? Can we do something with it when it's not being used so it's not just this boondoggle? So sometimes it's really good to look at the past and do this work collectively, because you find blind spots that everyone has, or you find things that everyone notices and agrees on, and it brings them to the surface. That's why I'm going to give you just 1 minute more. Look over what you've written and just see if you need to add a word or two to either arrow. Top right or bottom left, 60 seconds more. What else are you going to add? And that's about time. This has been a mini version of using this tool, but it's about the right pace and rhythm. If you find yourself using it, you'll get used to it and you may adjust this, but you spend more time on the future question and you really make people separate out hopes and fears and expectations. Like, it can appear as a cloud so that you're not trying to categorize these answers, but you're making people think, well, that's what I hope about the future, but that's what I expect. That's what I fear. And that's the thing that's in my blind spot. So it becomes this whole mess of future perception, future stuff coming towards us over the horizon. And you're really trying to elicit people's admission of what they hope and fear, but also what they're not looking at, the things that they think can't be avoided. And then you spend a little bit less time on the stuff from the past, but you do think, what is still going to be lingering? What can't we get away from? What isn't finished yet? What actions are happening now whose consequences are going to endure? But the point of this work is to imagine the future we're going to inhabit. And this is the fundamental issue when we're designing for uncertainties, because we don't know what the world holds. And the chances are it won't just be like a point on the graph. It won't be a repetition of what's gone before. It won't just be an extension or an extrapolation of the present. When we live through turbulent times, as your country and mine are now, if you're in the US, I'm in the UK, when we live through these turbulent times, it is messy knowing what comes next at any level, from the deeply local to the national. So this activity just surfaces that question of, what do we know or think about the future that our plan is going to have to inhabit? And that's all well and good. And I've spent a fair amount of this session talking about that. But the real issue is always going to be between what's coming from the future and what we're still dealing with from the past. What are we actually going to do? And this, I'm going to give you another small set of tools, simple drawing and conversation, and I'm just going to give you a very short amount of time for each one, so you can see what it feels like to try and decide your way into this cloudy future. So once again, you're going to take a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be landscape, maybe that's just my preferred orientation, but long sides at the top and bottom works really well. And you're going to divide it with just a single horizontal line. So you're just going to put a line across the middle there. And depending on your personality type, some people fold the piece of paper and then smooth it to get an exact 50% fold. Other people just go cowboy style and slash across from right to left. But whatever you choose, you're going to divide this piece of paper into a top half and a bottom half. And what I want you to think, it doesn't have to be the definitive answer set in stone once and for all, but I just want you to think, having looked at those arrows and that situation you face in the future, if you achieve only one thing in the next time period, it should be what? So I don't know what you've chosen to plan for. It could be a big organization, a small team. It could just be for yourself. That'll affect the timescale you're thinking at. You might be thinking, how do I get through Christmas? You might be thinking, how do we get through the next 5 years? As I say, I've got some people in the Southern Hemisphere who are currently looking ahead to 2070, but that's on a totally different timescale of projects. But whatever timescale feels right for you, and doing it by feel is perfect, what should the priority be? Out of that cloud of things from the future, things from the past, if you were just going to achieve one thing, what should it be? And just put that above the line. I'm just going to give you maybe a minute to think about it. You're not going to be sworn to achieving it. So just pick something that you think is the top goal that you should achieve in that cloud of uncertainty. And you've got about 30 seconds. Maybe something came to you immediately, or maybe you're having a bit of a think about it. but you've still got half a minute before you've got to finalize what you put there. And that's about time. And some of us will have found it very easy to choose one priority. Some of us, it would have required a bit more thought. The strange thing is, if you put people under a bit of pressure, usually something surfaces. It might not be perfect first time, but this kind of process is iterative. You go through all the steps and then you double back, see what emerged and correct it. But what appears above the line in this document is called commander's intent in the military. It's like the top line of your orders for the day. It's the one thing that all efforts are directed to achieving. Like, we must capture that hill by the close of the day. And if you know the overall intent, then you can make sure that every other action feeds that intent. Like, did you bring ammunition? Brilliant. We can use that to fight our way up the hill. Did you bring 10,000 cheese sandwiches? Well, it's good to feed the soldiers because they're trying to get up the hill, but maybe 10,000 cheese sandwiches is too many. Whatever it is, however ludicrous or trivial, however big or small, everyone should be able to point towards this overall goal and say, that is the thing that my efforts are ultimately serving. This is the command intent. This is the thing that we must achieve in this time. And that involves setting a priority. I'm not going to hold you to what you set in 60 seconds now, but you have chosen something off the basis of that cloud of uncertainty that you had. And now below the line, in the same sort of time frame, I just want you to jot down some examples of the actions you could take that would help us to achieve this. So just think of some actions that would help you to achieve that singular goal you set above the line. 60 seconds, you can jot down multiple actions. They can be contradictory, just almost like brainstorming. What actions could you take to achieve that one priority goal? And that's time. So you should have the piece of paper with your cloud of ideas around the arrow from the past and the arrow from the future. And now you have this piece of paper with an overall goal or command intent and some example actions of how you could achieve that intent. Now you're going to take another piece of paper, divide it with a line in the middle again. And on this piece of paper, looking at the goal you've set, looking at the actions, I want you to suggest some measures for success and excellence. So above the line, how would you know if you'd been successful in this goal? And below the line, what would excellence look like? What would going beyond the goal, achieving more that you intended, look like? So I'm going to give you a little bit longer, 90 seconds, but I want you to fill in both parts, above and below the line. How would you know if you'd been successful in meeting this goal? And what would excellence look like? And you can have more than one answer. You can have contradictory answers. Come up with as many measures of success and excellence as you can. You've still got about 30 seconds. You can just jot down dot points, ideas, wayward thoughts, wild ideas for how you'd measure success and excellence. And I'm just going to talk for a bit now. You can carry on writing if you want to, but I think this is actually one of the most important things to consider. So often, particularly knowing we're talking at an event hosted by Metro New York Library Council, many of you will be in libraries or institutions that traditionally have been about loaning items, been about people coming through the door, footfall. It's really important to think of new ways of developing measures and metrics. And if we had longer together, I might take you through some tools to do that. But if you don't come up with your own measures, they'll be defined and decided by someone else, and they may not suit what your service really does in the world. And they may prove to be problematic when we get into these uncertain times. For example, once the buildings can't have people visiting them, the whole notion of measuring library use through visits, through footfall, becomes really challenging. And one of the tricks of the kind of work we're trying to do here, last week and this, is to imagine the crisis before it arrives. So I was doing some work with the Spanish Culture Ministry on this issue of looking at the challenges that might face public libraries in the future and how that might even affect the way we measure the impact they have on the community. And they said, if it stops being about who steps through the door or how many items go on loan, we need to develop more sophisticated measures of community impact, whether qualitative or quantitative, whether we're serving a student body or we're serving a city, or whether we're librarians within a law firm. We need to be able to articulate and measure how we make a difference. So that's why we spend some time on this question now, so that if you take friends, colleagues, stakeholders, even wider members of your community through this process of the uncertainty, the goal and actions, and then measures of success and excellence, you enlist people into the question of how are we going to show that we've done a good job? And how are we going to show what it means if we go further than just merely meeting our goals? What does excellence look like? I'm going to get you to take one more piece of paper now, and I hope you can see how each one of these stacks up. It's not a lot of paper, it's not a lot of writing, but there is a process here, and it is taking you into a sort of deeper awareness of what's going on and how to plan for it. I'm going to get you to take one more piece of paper, and you don't have to draw a line this time, just for variety's sake. There is not a horizontal line, there is not a vertical line. But what I'm going to get you to do is answer 3 questions. To make this happen, this goal that you've set with the example actions, with the measures of success and excellence, what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? And what should we continue doing? And that's quite a big question. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to address all 3 of those. You might just write start, stop, and continue on your piece of paper here. But to make this thing happen, what should you start doing? What should you stop doing? And what should you continue doing? And see if you can come up with some answers in the next 2 minutes. They can be contradictory, they can be complex, you're just brainstorming, but give me some answers. What should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? You've got about 30 seconds left to come up with your answers here. Maybe you found it easy, in which case go back and see if you can find some more answers. Maybe one of them is particularly hard, and maybe that makes it the most strategically interesting one for you. To achieve your goal, what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? And that's time. So I'm going to ask you now just to pop in the chat, which one of these was the hardest for you to answer? Start, stop, or continue? Melanie says stop. For Mary Carol as well, it's stop. David says finding things to stop was tough. So is Peter, Hailing, Hope, Gretchen, Shima, Jerry. Quite consistent here. Going to give it a moment more. Anyone else with an answer? Anyone else find a different question difficult to answer? For Eve and Anthony, also stop. And I'm sort of glad to hear you say that, because I think this is the most difficult and therefore the most important question in all of this, the whole process across both weeks. Especially in library land, there's always a tendency to take on more. And for information professionals now, it's incredibly hard to define and delimit what they do. You know, people are always willing to go that extra mile to help people. And the traditional dynamic of the librarian with the community they serve, whether that is a law firm or a university or a community, is you come in, you have an information need or another need, and I try to meet it for you. It's not like teachers, preachers, doctors, or lawyers, where the professional kind of has authority and controls the encounter. Although libraries have rules and they have their history and their culture and a way of working which limits the interaction, in many ways librarianship is a very responsive profession, and that means we try and sort of deal with whatever we're presented with. And suddenly people find themselves, as you know, in public libraries, having to think about drug resuscitation, coping with the homeless, new digital information needs, like increasing complexity. And that means that stuff is always being piled on, and often it is good and important and vital and worthwhile work. And the one thing we never do is just stop doing something, never give up on stuff. And the more you pile on someone's plate, the more problematic that can get, because eventually it's just too much. You get overburdened and things break down. Even if you are just swapping out something like for like, there is a need for elbow room or space. Even if you're just replacing all the computers in your office, that means there has to be a day of work where you stop, you unplug, they take the old machines out, they put the new machines in, they set them up, they boot them up, they show you how to log on, they train you on the new system, and that's just replacing something like for like. That's not even doing something new. Every change imposes this burden of time, energy, appetite, enthusiasm, resources, finances, And you need to stop to make the elbow room for any change or initiative to succeed. So above all, you need to answer this question: what otherwise good and useful thing will I surrender, sacrifice, give up, or ease off on in order to achieve the thing that I have set as my goal? And this is the question you must wrestle with. I have set a priority. I have actions, I have measures. I must now relax or release or pause something else, which is good and could be useful and vital, but I need to pause that to do the thing I've said is more important. And that's the essence of strategy, choosing one thing rather than another because you've made a bet on the future. So that's something to ponder if you choose to take these tools to structure a conversation about planning for uncertainty. But the last thing I want to do before we come together and maybe have a more general discussion, I want to take that one step further to really move into reality. So we looked at this cloud of uncertainty. What future are our plans going to have to inhabit? Will there be a snowstorm? Will I need my tonsils out? What will my organization face in the future? We set a goal. We chose some actions that would help us to achieve it. And we set measures of success and excellence. And then we thought about what we would need to stop, start, and continue in order to get to that goal, really focusing on that question of stop. But we don't have to do it all at once. You know, most organizational changes, most strategic changes, it's like trying to turn the Titanic. You've got to start hauling that wheel very early. But we don't have to move the whole ship at once. We can send out a little pilot to see what happens. So I'm going to get you to answer 3 more questions on one final piece of paper. And once again, you don't have to draw a line. I want you to imagine designing a pilot project to test the approach you're taking to this goal that you've set. Just imagine doing a small version to test the water and see what happens. And you're just going to answer 3 questions in the space of 2 minutes. For such a pilot project, what would you need to resource it? What would you do in the pilot project? And what would that pilot project show? What would you need for the project? What would you do in the project? And what would it show? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to sit with those questions and see if you can come up with some answers. And that's time, wherever you've got to. Again, as I said, you can't save the world within 60 minutes, but I can give you a taste of what these tools feel like to use. Because if you know their appeal, but also their frustration, if you know their limits, but also the ways that they liberate you to think differently, you can take them and use them. And it's so much more useful than just someone lecturing you about method. If you want to be lectured about method, come to my website afterwards. I've written plenty about the things underpinning these tools, and you can dig deeper and really get into what's going on behind the scenes of these relatively simple questions. But in this session, we've thought about the cloud of uncertainty that faces us, both coming from the future and dragged with us from the past. We set a priority, looked at actions, looked at measures, what we start, stop, and continue, and then we knuckled down to making that a pilot. Okay, so you need to test this approach. What do you need to test it? What are you going to do to test it? And above all, what would it show? How would this pilot generate some evidence or data that lets us know if we're taking the right approach? Such simple questions, but they're enough to get people thinking about moving from analysis into action. And this is where we can tie it back to the work that we did in week 1. So in the first week, we spent a lot of time actually mapping miniature sort of scenarios, little future ecosystems that we might have to inhabit. And we decided on those future ecosystems, not on what we predicted, not on what we hoped or feared, but what would be most uncertain or what would be most troubling for us. If those uncertainties around the island washed ashore and changed the game, changed the ecosystem for us, which future contexts would be most challenging or most opportune? Which ones would really test our assumptions about what the future holds? And once you've gone through this process that we've gone through this week, just making a strategy, focusing a bit more, you can then take that and say, well, how would this affect your island? If you try to do what you've said today on this imagined future ecosystem, how would that work out? And would it work in all of the futures that you imagined? In all those different scenarios with those different arrangements of actors and transactors, different conditions and contexts, is your plan a good plan in all of those possible futures? So the tools we've gone through today, I've made them as simple as possible so you can use them at teams at any size, from a 3-person team to the whole organization. And they're written in language that you can use at whatever level of training or education or qualification. Really, they're meant to be as accessible as possible. But they make you look at that sort of mysterious blind spot and then move into doing something about it. So thank you so much for joining me today. And if you do want to read further or pick my brains, there's a website, mechanicaldolphin.com, and you can find me there. Thank you, Davis, for being a great host as always. Thank you, Tracy, behind the scenes. And thank you, everyone, for letting me make you work for 60 minutes.